The lights dimmed, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a flash of white spotlight, he appeared. The crowd erupted. The screams rolled through the arena like thunder shaking the walls. Cameras flashed like lightning, and there he was, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, standing beneath the blinding glow of the stage lights, his jeweled jumpsuit catching every flicker of brilliance. The air trembled with the roar of 20,000 hearts beating as one. Yet none of them, not even the band, not even security, could have guessed that within minutes, this would become one of the most unforgettable nights in Elvis Presley's entire career. If you love stories like this, real, emotional, and untold moments behind the world's greatest legends, make sure you subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Because tonight, we're diving deep into Elvis Presley, the untold story, a night that stunned the crowd, shocked security, and revealed a side of Elvis no one had ever seen before. It happened on a humid summer evening in 1977, just months before his untimely death. The king was performing in St. Petersburg, Florida, one of the last major shows of his life. He was tired, perhaps even more than he let on. His health had begun to falter, the relentless years of touring and pressure wearing him down. Yet the moment he stepped onto that stage, something inside him came alive again. The music, the lights, the crowd, they wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. He started with C.C. Rider, his voice strong, smooth, electrifying. The band followed his rhythm like a heartbeat. Fans swayed, cried, sang along. To them, Elvis wasn't just a man, he was a living miracle, the embodiment of music itself. But as the second verse soared and the spotlight followed his every move, something shifted. Elvis's gaze, once sweeping over the sea of faces, suddenly locked on a single point near the middle of the crowd, row 47. For a moment, he faltered, just slightly. His voice caught, almost imperceptibly, but the band noticed. Charlie Hodge, his longtime friend on stage, glanced over, sensing something was wrong. Elvis continued to sing, but his eyes stayed fixed. It was as if time slowed, and the music faded into a heartbeat. In that moment, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was no longer performing. He was seeing. Later, members of the audience would say they saw a change in his face, a shadow of shock, confusion, and then deep emotion. He raised a trembling hand, pointing toward that one spot in row 47. Security tensed, unsure what was happening. A hush rippled through the crowd. Elvis stopped singing mid-line. The band froze. The microphone lowered slowly in his hand as he squinted into the sea of lights. What he saw made him stop the show completely. "Hold on," he said softly, his voice echoing across the stadium. "Stop the music." For a man who lived and breathed performance, for someone who had mastered every second of stage presence, stopping mid-song was unheard of. But Elvis didn't care. Something deeper than the show had just pulled him out of his performance. Security rushed to the edge of the stage. The audience grew silent, confused, whispering. Elvis stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "There's a man," he said, his voice low but steady. "Right there, in the blue shirt. Somebody get him some help." At first, people thought it was a joke, another bit of Elvis humor. But the look on his face said otherwise. The crowd turned their heads toward row 47, where a man was slumped forward in his seat, motionless. His wife was shaking him, her face pale with terror. Within seconds, medics and guards pushed through the crowd. The music had stopped. The lights dimmed. The laughter, the cheers, the chaos, all gone. All that remained was the faint sound of Elvis breathing into the microphone and the murmur of a shocked audience. "He's having a heart attack," someone shouted. Elvis stepped back, gripping the mic stand tightly. His lips parted, but no words came. He just stood there, watching as the medics tended to the man. He looked heartbroken, almost as if he could feel the man's pain himself. Maybe he did, maybe, in that instant, Elvis Presley wasn't the king, but simply a man watching another life hang in the balance. Minutes passed like hours. The medics worked frantically, and the crowd waited in silence. Elvis knelt down near the front of the stage, lowering his microphone. Please, he whispered. Everyone, pray with me. The audience bowed their heads. 20,000 people, once screaming with excitement, now united in stillness and prayer. This was no longer a concert. It was a vigil. After what felt like an eternity, the man was lifted onto a stretcher. His wife followed, tears streaming down her face. As they carried him out, Elvis stood motionless, his eyes following until they disappeared from view. Then, softly, he turned to the crowd. I'm sorry, y'all, he said quietly. Sometimes God reminds us what really matters. And then, without music, without the flash or the fame, Elvis began to sing, a cappella. The first notes of Peace in the Valley floated through the air, trembling with emotion. His voice cracked once, but he kept going. Every word carried weight, every syllable seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. People wept openly. Security guards, grown men hardened by years of chaos, were seen wiping tears from their eyes. That it wasn't entertainment anymore, it was communion. When the song ended, the crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a thunderous, emotional standing ovation. Elvis smiled faintly, but his eyes glistened. He took a deep breath and said, "That's what life's about, love, faith, and each other." Then he nodded to the band, who hesitated before easing back into the next song. But something had changed. The energy in the room had transformed. It wasn't about showmanship anymore. It was about humanity. Later, after the concert, Elvis refused to leave the venue until he got an update about the man in row 47. When the paramedic finally returned and told him that the man had survived, Elvis broke into tears backstage. "Thank the Lord," he whispered. He sent flowers and a handwritten note to the hospital that night, signed simply, E.P. That moment, witnessed by thousands, became one of the most powerful and mysterious chapters in Elvis Presley, the untold story. It was never filmed, never broadcast, and only lived on in the memories of those who were there, and in the quiet whispers of fans who knew the king was more than his music. Elvis had always been known for his generosity, but moments like these revealed the soul behind the legend. He was the king of rock and roll, yes, but he was also a man of deep compassion, humility, and faith. In that brief moment, when he stopped the concert, he reminded the world that even icons bleed, even kings pray. People who were in that arena say they left different that night. One woman, now in her 80s, said, "I came to see Elvis, but I left feeling like I'd seen an angel." And maybe she wasn't wrong, because in the years since his passing, stories like this continue to surface, moments when Elvis went beyond fame, beyond expectation, and simply gave himself to the people. Whether it was helping fans pay for hospital bills, comforting strangers, or stopping entire concerts to make sure one soul was safe, that was who he truly was. The tabloids never captured it. The headlines never told it. But the fans remember. And in their memories, he still lives, not just as a performer, but as a presence. To this day, whenever someone watches footage of Elvis performing, there's a certain glow that seems to surround him, a sense that the music came from someplace higher, deeper. And maybe that's what made him different. For all his struggles, his flaws, his pain, he carried something divine on that stage. Something no camera could ever fully capture. When the king sang, the world listened, not just with their ears, but with their hearts, and so that night in St. Petersburg remains one of the most poignant testaments to who Elvis Presley really was. Not the rhinestone icon or the Hollywood actor, but the man who stopped everything for a stranger in need. That's Elvis Presley, the untold story, the real king of rock and roll. The crowd had long gone home that night, but the echoes lingered. Backstage, the dressing room smelled faintly of cologne and roses, gifts from fans scattered across the counter beside empty water bottles and a half-finished cup of tea. Elvis sat in front of the mirror, still wearing his white jumpsuit, the rhinestones catching the dim light. He didn't move for a while. The noise of the arena faded into the hum of the air conditioner, and for the first time in hours, there was silence. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes beneath the sparkle, lines that weren't there a few years ago. He leaned closer to the mirror, as if searching for something deeper than his own face. What did she see in me? He thought. Why did that moment hit me so hard? Charlie Hodge walked in quietly, carrying a towel and a fresh glass of water. You okay, E? He asked. Elvis didn't look up. She reminded me of Mama, he said softly. That lady, the way she looked at me. Like she was seeing something that wasn't even me, maybe something she lost. Charlie didn't answer. He knew better than to break moments like that. Elvis had his stage self, the king, the performer, the myth, and then he had these small, fleeting glimpses of truth. The man who still missed his mother. The man who prayed before every show. The man who could break down over a stranger's story. She said her husband loved my songs, Elvis continued, eyes fixed on the mirror. Can you imagine that, man? Two people sittin' in a kitchen somewhere, maybe in the middle of nowhere, just listenin' to me sing, dreamin' about coming to see me. And I'm worried about what ring I'm wearin' or how my hair looks. Charlie smiled sadly. That's what makes you different, E. You don't just sing for yourself. You sing for them. Elvis nodded, but there was a weight in his chest that wouldn't leave. That night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, he walked alone through the quiet corridors of the arena, his footsteps echoing like distant drums. Somewhere deep inside, he whispered, "Thank you, Margaret," before stepping out into the cold night air. In the months that followed, that memory never left him. The king of rock and roll had sung for millions, but now, each show carried a shadow of that night, a ghost of tenderness that hovered just behind his every note. When he performed "Love Me Tender," fans noticed he closed his eyes more often, as if searching through the darkness for something only he could feel. Even during rehearsals, his voice would soften. This one, he told the band once, ain't just a love song. It's a promise. A promise to keep singing for the ones who ain't here no more. It was rare for Elvis to explain himself. He didn't have to. The band understood. They could feel it too, that subtle shift in him, that quiet ache beneath the glitz, behind the glamour. Elvis Presley, the untold story was unfolding, the story of a man who carried the weight of 1,000 hearts on his own. The cameras showed fame, but offstage there was solitude. There were nights when he'd sit at the piano alone, playing softly in the dark, the same melody over and over again. Sometimes gospel, sometimes blues, sometimes nothing but humming. Graceland became his sanctuary and his prison. The walls were filled with laughter and music, but also memories that clung like ghosts. He'd look at photos of his mother and say quietly, "I hope she's proud." Then, almost always, his gaze would drift to that small box in the corner of his bedroom, the one with Margaret's letter. He kept it near his bed until the very end. One night, in early 1977, as his health began to falter, Elvis sat with one of his backup singers, Kathy Westmoreland. They talked about faith, music, and the price of fame. Kathy later recalled how his voice grew distant when he said, "I've seen a lot of faces in the crowd, but sometimes it's just one face that stays with you forever." She asked him which face that was. He smiled faintly. "An old lady once told me she waited 50 years to see me sing. She came to one show, and it changed my life." Kathy said he looked away then, eyes wet, staring into nothing. "I think she gave me more than I gave her," he whispered. "I think she reminded me what love really means." It was the last time he ever spoke of Margaret. The years rolled by, and after Elvis's passing in 1977, stories about that concert began to resurface. Fans wrote letters, shared memories, and passed down tales to their children. Some swore they'd been there, others just wished they had. There were grainy photographs, blurred and faded, showing a faint outline of Elvis kneeling before an elderly woman, his hand reaching for hers. The moment was real, even if history had almost forgotten it, and maybe that's the beauty of stories like these. They survive not through the news or the tabloids, but through hearts. Through the people who felt it. A journalist once asked a former band member about that night. Why didn't Elvis have it filmed? The man smiled knowingly. Because some things ain't meant for cameras. Some things are meant just for souls. Years later, in 1985, Margaret's granddaughter visited Graceland for the first time. She carried a small bouquet of lilies and a copy of that same letter Elvis had once held. When she reached the meditation garden, she knelt quietly and whispered, "He remembered her, Grandpa. He really did." The wind moved through the trees, soft and slow, as if answering back. She placed the flowers by his grave, touched the cool marble, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Presley. You made her last wish come true." And in that moment, under the Memphis sun, two stories, one of fame, one of faith, finally met in peace. What happened on that night in 1975 was more than a concert, it was a collision of souls. Elvis, the king of rock and roll, met Margaret, the queen of quiet devotion. One carried the sound of the world, the other carried the silence of loss. And between them bloomed something eternal. When we talk about Elvis Presley, the untold story, this is what we mean, the parts of his life not written in record sales or chart numbers, but in the fragile moments that no one could script. The human parts. The broken parts. The sacred parts. Behind every dazzling performance was a man who felt deeply. Behind every roar of applause was a silence that followed him home. He gave his voice to the world, but sometimes, in return, the world gave him moments like Margaret, reminders that music was never about fame. It was about faith. Today, almost 50 years later, the legend of that night still lingers online, whispered in fan forums, passed through families, remembered in quiet reverence. Did you hear about the time Elvis stopped a concert for an old woman? Someone will ask. And someone else will nod, saying, "Yeah, that's the real Elvis." Because the king didn't just reign on stage. He ruled in hearts, quietly, humbly, endlessly. The lights may have gone out, but his music still burns. Each time Love Me Tender plays on an old radio, somewhere, someone remembers. Maybe an old man holding his late wife's picture. Maybe a young fan who never got to see him live. Maybe someone who just needed to believe that kindness still exists in the world. Elvis gave that to us, not just through sound, but through soul, and that, perhaps, is his greatest encore. So before you go, take a moment to breathe it in, the memory, the music, the message. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet power of compassion and the way one simple question can change the world, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe for more stories like this, real, human, and unforgettable. Like this video if you believe the king of rock and roll still lives on in every act of kindness. Share it with someone who could use a little light today. And comment below, what does Elvis Presley mean to you? Because legends don't die when their hearts stop beating, they live on, every time a story like this is told.